Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're actually stepping right into the shadows to dissect a pretty chilling psychological fable. It's this incredibly dark story about a kingdom that's held together not by loyalty, not by prosperity, but by an actual, literal, dark liturgy of fear. We're going to explore this text as a literary critique of state-sponsored psychological oppression. Basically, we're breaking down how an entire society, and by extension, the human mind itself, can be completely paralyzed by its own history. So, I want to set the scene for you here. Picture the vaulted silence of these massive royal halls. It's majestic, sure, but it's also incredibly suffocating. Our sources describe a king sitting on a throne that paradoxically feels way more like a cage. He's totally surrounded by the very power he wields, yet he's completely trapped by it. The air is heavy, and there's just this distinct, impending dread hanging right over the polished floors. Which really brings us to the central mystery of this whole fable. What dark foundations keep a rigid world from collapsing? I mean, if the ruler himself is trapped, how on earth does the system even survive? Together, we're going to take a metaphorical descent into the state's terrifying underworld to find out exactly how this architecture of fear is built, literally block by block. So let's start with part one, the kingdom's gilded facade. Now, the state desperately wants you to focus on the gold leaf and velvet. This represents the superficial illusion of their power, right? It's a luxurious, flawless surface that's entirely designed to preserve the world exactly as it is, a totally stagnant, unchanging status quo. But hidden right underneath those floorboards are the architectural bones. These are the jagged, repressed truths that the state is absolutely terrified of and desperate to keep out of sight. Moving on to part two, the deep skeletal belly. To really wrap our heads around this control, we've got to strip away that shiny facade and head downward into the damp catacombs. Down here in the ancestral vaults, the foundations aren't made of pristine marble. No, they're made of stained blueprints and bitter fertilizer. These stained blueprints are basically the original, messy, rejected designs of society, the worthless scraps of slighted lives. And they are nourished by a bitter fertilizer made of historical trauma and prejudices. These elements are what anchor the twisted roots of the kingdom. And honestly, this isn't just about how a fictional state is built. It's a profound metaphor for the inescapable structural reality of the human mind, which is also built upon its own repressed past. So, this skeletal belly of the earth serves a very specific, dark purpose. It hides what they call the poison of dissent. By taking individual potential and all those messy, vibrant ideas and shoving them deep down into the dark, the state keeps them safely locked away from the pristine, perfect surface of the rigid order. Which brings us to part three, the architects of fear. Now, a structure like this doesn't just maintain itself. It requires active enforcement, and that falls to the High Inquisitor, a figure whose very heart is described as a fortress of exclusion. And he commands three terrifying psychological manifestations known as the Inquisitor Knights. First, you have the Jester Knight, representing the superego. He sets up these narcissistic traps to lock dreamers right inside their own vanity. Next is the Bard Knight, representing memory and historical trauma. And finally, the Shadow Knight, who acts as the ego. He enforces reality testing using heavy masonry to literally wall in potential. These aren't just guys in armor. Their entire purpose is to completely ossify the psyche, paralyzing the citizens into a permanent state of stone silence. Let's zoom in on one of them in part four, the Bard Knight's Harvest. As the High Priest of Memory, his primary weapon is something called affective displacement. Basically, he strikes these dissonant chords to dissolve present reality into a suffocating mist of guilt. Just think about that for a second. He actually conjures personal memory and historical stereotypes as a mist that literally smells like ancient dust and bitter fertilizer. He takes the thorns of the past and weaponizes them against the present mind. It makes the populace feel way too guilty and way too terrified to ever look forward. The text describes him as the perverted gardener who methodically prunes the dead wood of hope. Unlike a normal gardener who, actually wants things to grow, the Bard Knight harvests fear. Anytime a vibrant branch of change even tries to sprout in a person's mind, he steps in and brutally grafts it right back onto those twisted roots of the past we talked about earlier. He's there to ensure that absolutely nothing new can ever blossom. And this brings us to the exact, incredibly methodical liturgy the state uses to completely break a person. Step 1 is alchemical inversion. They take the raw fire of imagination and melt it down into heavy iron shackles. Step 2 is that perverted gardening, where any spark of hope is just pruned away. Step 3 is darkest masonry. They use a hidden trowel to wall in human potential, burying the dreamer's heroic silhouette. Which inevitably leads to step 4, stone silence, the complete, permanent immobilization of the soul into a permanent tomb. It is literally a highly efficient assembly line for destroying the human spirit. But things don't always go to plan. Part 5, a threat to the masonry. Because even the darkest, heaviest masonry has cracks, right? Back up in the throne room, the Shadow Knight suddenly walks in with this heavy, uncertain tread, and he's holding something truly terrifying. Now, the state thrives on the cold reality of iron shackles and rigid order, the world as it is. But the Shadow Knight brings in a tattered ledger. It's a messy design, a rough sketch of the world as it could be. This chaotic becoming actively mocks their rigid masonry, simply because it refuses to follow the neat little lines of their stained blueprints. And look at what happens. The jester's bells fall totally silent. The Shadow's trowel becomes completely useless against the fire of imagination. The narcissistic traps, they don't work anymore. The heavy masonry of the ego is useless. This tattered ledger, this one vibrant branch of thought, carries a poison of dissent that entirely bypasses the High Inquisitor's walls of exclusion. The fire of imagination is actively dissolving the dark masonry of the state, right before their very eyes. And that leads us to our final section, Part 6, the burden of ancient history. So stepping out of the fable for just a moment, the true meaning of this dark tale is deeply psychological. Ancient history actually acts as a literal burden for the psyche. Those thorns of the past we mentioned, they aren't just bad memories. In the framework of psychological oppression, they manifest as a suffocating physical weight against the lungs. The state, or honestly even our own internal fears, forces our superego to constantly stare at our repressed failures. This is a highly deliberate mechanism designed to extinguish the fire of imagination, basically ensuring that your heroic silhouette stays buried beneath the heavy masonry of your own history. Which brings us to the final and probably the most important question of this entire explainer. The fable warns us about the powerful connection between personal memory and overarching state control. So ask yourself, are you wearing iron shackles forged from your own history? And what messy, vibrant designs, what rough sketches of the world as it could be, are you keeping buried in the dark just because of the heavy masonry of the past? Don't let the Bard Knight prune your hope. Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating fable with me, and I'll see you in the next explainer.